Welcome to another episode of Disaster Empire Quick Views. This is the podcast where we talk to thought leaders and innovators in resilience. And this time around, I have a great guest, Sean Riggin, who is going to talk to us about emergency management and crisis. And I really want to dive right in. So, Sean, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
Excellent. Well, hey, how did your interest in crisis and emergency management come about? And how has it evolved over time?
So I didn't realize starting out that my interest was in crisis. I realized that the Army told me that it was time to go to Sarajevo in the middle of a conflict there. And I was a civil affairs guy, which was like as close as I could get to the super cool guys in the special operations community. And so we went to Sarajevo and we handled displaced civilians and, you know, sort of the post-conflict chaos and disaster. And I realized really early on that ability to go into a community and like immediately become part of it, the way that a disaster sort of compresses time and people that are helpful and useful get brought right into the community, it was really interesting to me. Of course, I was 21, so I was too young and dumb to realize what was going on. I was just, you know, caught up in the moment and trying to help. But over time, I realized that people connection is really what has driven my interest in disaster and my, you know, my desire to be there sort of, you know, in the middle of it when it happens and try to help. You know, I've had a lot of opportunities to be involved in policy decisions and all of those things. But now that I'm sort of in a new role since I've retired from the police department, I have the opportunity to really engage in the areas that I want to, and where I want to is in those on the ground, sort of dealing with the people and dealing with those social aspects of disaster.
Well, I think that we could probably have you back on and talk for an hour or two about your experience in Sarajevo, because I imagine that you had a lot of lessons learned as young as you said that you were and have influenced, you know, your future work. And I find that is the case for most of us. We didn't pick out this field, right? We somehow made our way to it. And thank you for your time in the police department and law enforcement as well. Hey, so I definitely want to get your take because this is a question that I ask all of my guests, and based on what you've shared about your background so far, what does resilience mean to you?
You know, I cheated and I watched your podcast because I knew you were going to ask, and I spent like 3
No
hours.
worries.
I spent like 3 hours trying to come up with a really good answer, and the answer for me is it's whatever a particular community decides resiliency is. I think that we lean on this idea of build back better because it sounds good and it fits on a bumper sticker. But what's the paragraph that follows the lead-in sentence there? And I think it gets really complicated really quickly. And so we know that challenged communities become more challenged after disaster. We know that, you know, elite capture and some of the nerdy stuff that happens in a community, depending on where the sort of socioeconomics break out, they get bigger and deeper. Those divides get bigger and deeper after a disaster. So to say build back better, you have to immediately ask yourself for who, right? And so resiliency is whatever the community that has experienced that disaster in that moment, it's the most that they're capable of in the environment in that moment, and what it is that they're going to decide their future looks like, because it's not going to be the same community that it was pre-disaster. And I think just a little bit more nuanced of what resiliency really means would be really helpful in the current environment, because we talk about, you know, FEMA talks about whole community, but then how do you actually make that happen, right? And it's a lot of those sort of catchy ideas that require a lot of work. And I think that we need to do a better job in the industry of explaining that we cannot solve all of the problems. We cannot build back better. We can do a little bit better a lot of times. And I think that's what long-term resiliency at the sort of macro level looks like.
I think that's a great way to look at it. And if you're watching the podcast, you know that I'm talking about what I see is the big idea right now is we've always worked on the preparedness side, no matter where we are in terms of, you know, crisis, emergency, planning, but it's really leaning forward, I think, more into understanding risk and to building that resilience before you need it, right? So to speak. And I think those are where the synergies really come in. So thank you for your answer on that. Also, let's dive in because you're sitting on the emergency management community side, and I hear the terms crisis and emergency kind of used interchangeably whether it's crisis management, emergency management. I'd love to hear from you. What's your take? What are the alignments and what are the differences?
Emergency sort of encaptures all of it, right? Because it's a nice broad term. I think a crisis is in the moment. That the crisis is. My wife and I were just talking about the submersible, right? And it was a tragedy. It was a crisis. It was not a disaster. It did not exceed the local community's ability to respond. It did not have long-lasting impact for people who were not immediately impacted by that, that tragedy. I almost said disaster right there. That would have been silly. But it's
a term we're used to, right? Even we have to catch ourselves.
Absolutely. So I think the terminology, it's an important issue depending on which circle you're in. But I also think it's important to recognize ways that we can talk just to plain folks, right? That'll understand all this nerdy stuff that you and I study and live and breathe, that there has to be a sort of one-to-one connection in terms that are simple and straightforward. So your audience, for instance, is, really well educated, is leaning forward into the space. And we can talk about what is the difference between a crisis and a disaster and an emergency, and what is risk tolerance and what is disaster management. And, we can get into that, but it has to go beyond navel gazing and really what are we pushing out at a level that is useful to the world. And the example that I like to use is I don't take my car to a mechanic because he's ASE certified and he has 15 certificates on the wall. He does. It literally covers the whole wall. It's kind of funny. But I take it to him because when I don't take it to that guy and I just take it to the guy around the corner who works out of his shed, my car doesn't get fixed. So what are we doing to demonstrate value as opposed to just, I really like the idea that emergency management, disaster science is becoming a profession and we're trying to cross that Rubicon. But at the same time, the primary driver for me has to be what value are we providing to people who depend on us in their, on their worst day.
Hmm. And I think it's even worse for crisis management in companies because there really is very little education and training to really help people to understand the difference, right? There is some, as you're saying, that's building for emergency managers in the community. And I think that's awesome. But what I found is that it's not always exactly, it's similar, but not always exactly the same skill set to be the FEMA, so to speak, inside a company. And so I would love to see, and that can be a whole nother conversation, but I'd love to see the education pieces there. But like you said, I'm so excited that the profession is being professionalized, right?
Yeah.
And that is great to see happening over time. So those younger professionals or professionals coming new into roles like this are getting opportunities that we didn't have stepping in to the work. But hey, speaking of jargon and terms that we use, you've gotten really jazzed up about the term social capital. So Can you talk about what that is for this audience and provide some education there and talk about how is it helpful for emergencies and for crisis? So
first of all, I can talk about this for days. I'm going to try and scale it down to 45 or 50 minutes. No. So
thanks.
So the social capital theory it goes back decades, and we won't get into the history of it. But basically, what it says is this: it says that there's three primary ways that people engage in social relationships. Right? They engage in their bonded relationships, so like your family and your friends and your tight knit group. You engage in your bridging, which is your group's connection to other groups. And then depending on who you're reading, there's also linking, which is sort of your individual group's access to power center. When I talk to police officers, right, and we're doing some leadership training for those folks, just as those are probably going to be the first people out of disaster after the zero responders, the people in the community. And we talk about what is linking capital. Well, the reality is that linking capital is probably that police officer in every single one of those communities, that they are the residents' access to decision makers. And so understanding that that's your role in that environment is really important. And so that's where that sort of social capital piece comes in. But the other thing is, in a disaster, and I've spent my entire life in a uniform as a professional, right? And we're here to help you people, darn it, so stay back and let us do it. And what we've found over time is that we don't save the day. Like, we can put out the fire, but we can't watch your kids while you go put your store back together. And there's that ongoing conversation about do we need to bring back the people first or the businesses first? And how do we sort of ride that divide? And the answer is always, it's always both, as quickly as possible all of the time. And how do you do that when your house is broken, when the child care center is down, and when there's not a store to go to? And the answer is you have to have that bonded group to help you with that informal insurance. Like, hey, Ashley, can I borrow $100 because I don't have any cash and all the ATMs are down? If you don't give me that $100, my level of crisis just went up dramatically.
Yeah.
But if we've got a good relationship, then it's really easy for me to go and make that next step. So now I can start engaging in the response myself. So it's interesting.
It is. It's definitely interesting in building those partnerships and those relationships. And one of, the very first blogs that I shared was some YouTube and TED Talks. And with the TED Talks, particularly, one of the things that came up is a discussion of NGOs and their work in disasters. I think one of the main things I was trying to get across is that NGOs are great, but we really need to be building, right, that social capital. We need to build that capacity within communities to be able to help themselves prepare, right, be resilient for disasters and then deal with the aftermath, because we always say, right, that disasters, they start local and they end local. And once all of those resources are pulled out and go elsewhere to help, the community is left. And really trying to build that interrelationship or that infrastructure in the community between the resources already there, like local law enforcement and citizens, is so important. So if I'm catching onto that right, those are some of the concepts that you're thinking about, but you're also very interested in zero response. And so can you share with the audience, that terminology may be new to folks as well. What is that concept and how can it help us to be better at crisis and emergency management?
During the COVID sort of pandemic, we dealt with a lot of like who is essential and who is non-essential and what's a first responder and all of that. And I used to have my Twitter bio back when I was on Twitter was that I was a third responder because I was police administration. I was fire administration, right? I didn't get there first. I got there third. I got there after the guys on the ground and the girls on the ground, after the supervisor, then me. The zero responder is the person that called the cops. The zero responder is the person that did CPR until the ambulance got there. The zero responder is that person from within that bonded group or within that community that is not only going to be there when the incident actually happens, right? Maybe if we've got a really good coverage plan, we'll have a police officer there. If we've got phenomenal response times, we can get a fire truck there really quickly. And maybe, emergency management is not likely to respond to the initial scene for a little while, but your neighbor is going to be right there. And your neighbor, again, from something as simple as, can you watch my kids while I put out the fire in the kitchen? That's the person who has the most impact on the beginning of the incident. And that's the same person that's going to be with you at the end of the incident. And what we've learned is if we can keep those communities close to intact so that as many of those community members stay in them or come back to them, then we have a better odds of having that community look someday after the disaster as it did the day before the disaster. So that those sort of human connections, that ability of your neighbor to respond and to be that zero responder well before professionals is sort of for me, one of the best indicators that you're going to be able to recover this. You're going to be able to recover as a community and still maintain some of that original sort of community personality and culture and, all those things. Because otherwise, one of two things happens. Either your neighborhood comes in and gets bulldozed and, maybe you get bought out and maybe that community is literally not there anymore, which has a huge loss of, sense of place for people. Or, really big condos go up on waterfronts where there's been a community that's existed for 150 years. Yeah. Nothing good happens.
And we've seen that. We've seen that happen after Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana, and how long it took the communities to come back, and even some parts of it, were a complete loss. That's just one example, and there are many others out there as well. One of the things that I think about is just that building of communities, and you've hit on such an important topic because I know I've been talking, and I know others have been talking about individual resilience, and that's an important component. And then we talk about the business resilience, and that's an important component. And you were talking about whole communities earlier. But it's such a hole in our infrastructure right now because so many people don't stay in neighborhoods. They move around or they don't have those connections in, say, a large city or in a community, they don't even know who their neighbors are. So I think of the structures in Japan where it's mandatory to exercise together and they know each other and they have that capacity. Any thoughts on how we can replicate? I mean, we're not Japan, right? But any thoughts on how we could replicate something like that in the U.S.? And I know we have our local certs and American Red Crosses, and those are some good channels to help build that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I'm working with a client in Atlantic City that is trying to drive community cohesion to push down crime. So same sort of idea, right? If we can get people connected to the community, then they're going to have community expectations that don't allow crime. In the same way that you would have expect your neighbors to come out and help you, it has to be two things. One of them is you have to be able to provide value. So in this particular case, it's an economic development corporation that does a really good job of reaching out to like the 15 micro communities in their bigger community and finding out what their local needs are and then sort of sharing them out. So in that way, again, going back to that social capital model, you've got these smaller bonded sort of group. The Economic Development Corporation sort of fills that bridging role, right, and brings all of them together. And then because they can do that, they hit that link to the bigger power centers. But in order for any of that to work, they have to be providing value to those micro communities or no one will listen to them. And so for them, what they're doing is stuff as simple as storefront restorations, right? Hey, we'll give you some money to redo your storefront so that it looks more pleasing to people and, other people won't come in. Hey, our Economic Development Corporation has 5 people that speak 5 languages because in a little tiny community of 10,000 people, that's just a section of Atlantic City, there are 5 primary languages, which is, a lot to deal with. But if we know that the EDC is there to help us, then they're going to bring us together. And so in the event that we have some of that disaster come down, we've already got folks that are already out interacting with each other and able to draw upon those local resources in a way that's really coherent. And the thing is, you've been to disasters, I've been to disasters. The first thing that we try to figure out is how do we get the stuff to the people who need it? And always the things that are pre-organized make it easier, whether it's a CERT or whether it's a church group. Right? If you've already got a segment of the population sort of nailed down and you can in some way coordinate them, you are already ahead of the curve and you're going to get resources faster because I can just give you stuff and you can distribute it without me having to have and put a bunch of staff on the ground. And that's where that whole, it starts local and it ends local because, what happens first is who's going to watch my kids while I put out the fire? And then what's going to happen last is the churches that are still doing the food distributions 3 years into COVID, I work with a local pastor who's over 1 million pounds of food since the beginning of COVID. Nobody's helping this guy but the neighbors, right? And so that looks like resiliency to me because that community, the next time they have a problem, they're going to call the pastor and he's going to be right there and ready to go. And now he's got disaster experience, so he knows what to expect. That's the way I think it all comes together. But again, you have to have communities that are willing. And in a lot of places, we have transient communities. We have communities that are only looking inward and having a hard time connecting outward. As I said, in this particular EDC, they've done a great job by creating communication networks. It's different everywhere you go. But I think that has to be the goal is what are you doing to get people to engage with you and stay engaged with you? Because that is going to make everybody safer, whether it's crime or whether it's a tidal wave. Everybody gets safer, the better connected we are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such a challenging impediment, right? It is. I mean, it's such a challenge right now to move into that space and build something that's lasting and really provides that holistic resilience to a community. And I'd love to hear the example you gave. And I know there are highlights. I was in Hilton Head last year and visited Defusky Island. And, the community members there are very tight knit and they realized that if something bad happened, they could be cut off from the mainland, right, for a while. So they started their own community garden as a way so at least they could have some food stuff, right, available until help could get to them. And so they could try to take care of themselves. And, it's been something that on an ongoing basis is literally feeding the community. So I'd love to hear those types of stories and I'd love to see more of that. That's such a great aspect. But it brings me back and I wanted to ask you about your opinion of VOADs. Because those in the U.S. are the voluntary organizations active in disasters like our Red Cross and Salvation Army. I've had some great experiences working with them. But as you're going through this process, how do you think they can help or even if you have any, thoughts on how they might hinder that community, holistic community and emergency response. Love to hear your thoughts on them today, because I've been out of that side of the business for a while.
So I have to at first admit my bias. I am a huge advocate of Team Rubicon. I talk Team Rubicon all the time. Like, I live in, there's a Team Rubicon, there's 2 coffee mugs behind me that say Team Rubicon on them. But here's what I'll tell you, what draws me to that organization in particular, and doesn't have to be unique to them, but it's what I know about them, is that they will draw from a group of volunteers that need things to do, to feel useful and to feel prepared, right? And then they will integrate with the EM structure so that when Team Rubicon goes into town, they don't just show up, right? They show up, they talk to the emergency managers, they talk to the city managers, and so they integrate into the formal response. And that is really comfortable for me because I'm used to being part of that formal response. But what I know, from case studies and from friends that have been to other disasters, there are times when that formal response can be the impediment itself. I recently dealt with a community outside of all of these sort of aspects, and their number one problem was they can't get disaster response in because they can't get the trash picked up in the event that volunteers come and muck and gut the houses out. Now, the whole sort of operation stops because we can't be nimble enough to adjust to that. So if we're part of the formal response, well, then your VOAD stops at the door because it has the same challenges that the system it's a part of. If you had a church group go in there and just start doing it, it would probably be less focused. It would be less sort of community-wide. It might favor one group over another, but it would be making progress immediately as opposed to being sort of stuck in the mud of bureaucracy. So I think both have their roles. And I think there's a ton of research being done on emergence and sort of the groups that come out of disaster and are formed in that environment and stay together. I had the opportunity to respond to Hurricane Irma, which was right before Maria, and in the Virgin Islands. And in St. John, there was a group called Love City Strong that was like nobody, right? It was the people that were not rich people in St. John for the most part. And by the time everybody had come and gone and thrown all of these millions of dollars around, Love City Strong was the organization that was actually able to feed everybody in the island, that was actually able to get everybody phone calls because they had come from the community and because they did not allow the formal response to slow them down. They worked outside it. So I think you need both. And I think the problem is, for me, trying to figure out which side of that fence is most effective for me to stand on any given day. Because having been a part of a number of organizations, I get why having divergent missions is actually good for the community, but is not always good for the organization and creates challenges for everybody. So it's a tricky thing. Just keep throwing stuff at it and see what happens, right? And I think over time, people are smart and they'll figure it out. And keep giving them resources and see what happens, and let them do the things that they know that they need to do.
It reminded me of an event that I worked on. It was a tornado that hit Springfield, Massachusetts area. So that's Western Massachusetts. And there was, started going out as part of the response and knocking on doors, et cetera, and went to one of the local towns, and they were like, no, thanks, but no, we're good. We got it. And it took us a little while to be like, yeah, they're fine.
They're fine.
They don't need, we're like, you really don't need help. And they're like, no, we're taking care of each other. Like, we'll let you know. And I think that's the ideal. That's what I would love to see. Obviously it can't happen in every situation, but it was really great to see the community coming together and helping each other in that situation. So hopefully we'll see more and more of that over time as folks like yourself and others, keep trying to build this capacity.
Yeah, I think that the challenge for everybody is that the disaster landscape is changing, right? So we've all gotten pretty good at responding to hurricanes and tornadoes. But there's new tornadoes that in places that didn't have tornadoes before. So now we have that whole problem. And also, if you just look at, disaster occurrence in the last couple of months, it's rain. It's just plain old rainstorms. And so as much difficulty as the professional response world has to respond to that, now you've got these community groups that are just completely out of their depth because, they only have history to lean on. They don't have professional studies. And that's the thing that the emerging groups are going to struggle with more than the professional responders, is understanding that, like, hey, there's this new threat. I live in southern New Jersey, and now we have tornado threats and wildfire threats. Like, that wasn't even a thing.
Yeah.
And now it is. So that's easy. That's an aspect where, for instance, the professional responders do have a leg up because they can see these threats emerging. Whereas people that live in those communities that maybe now have a higher fire rating probably don't even.
Absolutely. Really great points. And it really speaks to all of us needing to be more flexible, adaptable, and pivot, because we do have these threats, as you said, coming at us in ways that they didn't previously. So, well, hey, is there anything that you wanted to share before we wrap up today?
I want to thank you for the time. I think that anytime that we can, those of us that are sort of living and breathing this can get together and talk to the other nerds in the room, because I'm going to guess that you have a pretty nerdy audience. I know as a follower I am. I think we can get these ideas out there. And I think that when I sit and I listen to these podcasts, I really get a better sense of what is the overall sort of universe of theory. Because I can get really lost in that micro issue of community and social capital. And that's what I focus on, and forget about business risk management, which is just as important, but from a different aspect.
It's part of the community, right?
100%.
That they operate in. So.
And so I think that you're sort of what you're doing here is really helpful to bring all of us together in a way that, a lot of us just can't be together, or at least haven't been together for the last 3 years. And it's going to take a while for us to get back there. So I thank you for doing this. And also it's super fun. So I'm glad that I got to do it.
Well, I'm so glad that you came on as a guest. How can people get a hold of you if they want to learn more or reach out?
My primary presence online is on LinkedIn. Phone number's in there. Our company is Bluestone Services. We do a lot of work with economic development, corporations, and community stuff. I am just not grown up enough to deal with the toxicity of Facebook. I can't do it. But LinkedIn is a good place for Sean. So that's where I go. And if you want to reach out to me, I am 100% reachable there all the time. And I love to engage on this stuff. I talk to people all of the time, all over the world. It's a really cool platform. It's a lot of fun for me to do. I would much rather take a call from somebody and not make any money and make a friend or a contact than not get that call. So please reach out.
Thank you so much for being on this episode of the podcast, Sean. Really appreciate having you here and hearing your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.